one of the thoughts Jason just shared was that CIOs have one of the toughest jobs in the world. And as Rami noted earlier, Sapphire has continued to invest in the success and the ecosystem around CIOs for a few years now. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes telling all of you about a new pillar in our overall investment into the CIO innovation ecosystem, which we are calling the CIO Innovation Index, which we believe is really putting in the building blocks for the industry's first tracker of startup-led innovation within IT. And by the way, I do not relish having to go right after Jason Ponton. Looking back, we should have sequenced this differently, but here we are. Trying. And all of you that are in the room here today are actually getting a first look at this data since we concluded the research, the Innovation Index research at Sapphire Ventures, and then shortly you will be receiving a full copy of the report as well before we release it out to the public in a couple of weeks. Before I dive into what we actually found, a couple of thoughts on what compelled us to actually do this research. In our work with CIOs over the last several years, there's a couple of recurring innovation challenges that keep cropping up. One key challenge has been around the difficulty that CIOs and their teams face in parsing signal from noise. There's thousands of new tech startups that get funded every year. They're all knocking on IT's doors. Rami shared the numbers, over $40 billion invested last year alone into enterprise and B2B companies. And that's a constant headache for CIOs to know which startups really have the potential to be lasting players in the ecosystem. And it was in response to that feedback that a year ago, Sapphire launched the SV Explorer Innovation Portal that is today being used by over 300 CIOs, IT, and other corporate executives to search for, discover, and engage with vetted startups, either in the Sapphire portfolio or otherwise vetted by Sapphire, to solve specific problems. So far, so good. But there's a second recurring sentiment that keeps coming up. Even though CIOs are working around the clock to instill innovation into their organizations, while keeping the lights on, by the way, I'm sure you guys are aware of that, they really have no way to know how their innovation management and startup engagement practices and their adoption level of emerging technology stacks up relative to peers across different industries. And as VCs whose very job depends on making the right bets about how startup technology will fare in the enterprise, when we went out in the field and looked for a data set like that, we actually couldn't find one either. So we just decided to build our own. Because we believe that CIOs would be much better off if they measured their innovation playbooks and their startup engagement playbooks against an index of aggregate industry activity. And what we've established with the CIO Innovation Index is a set of simple but foundational measures that we believe really reflect the state of startup adoption and engagement in the enterprise. In collecting data on how CIOs engage with startups, we found sort of a three-pronged interaction model, and we looked at three key areas. Obviously, the adoption level of emerging technologies and startups is really where the rubber meets the road. We looked at innovation processes relating to startup discovery and engagement. How do CIOs and their teams explore new emerging technology domains? How do they educate themselves on new areas? How do they select startups to actually work with? And lastly, we were quite interested in CIOs' individual participation into the startup and innovation ecosystems. Because we know that as leaders, CIOs set an example with every action that they take. So we wanted to take a look at how they were getting personally involved in those ecosystems as an indicator more broadly. We talked to over 70 CIOs, CIOs defined as IT executives with either a CIO title or in some cases an SVP or VP level IT executive reporting directly into a global CIO. Pretty much all large enterprises, over 65% of the CIOs came from companies that had over 25,000 employees, and then the remainder were in the 5,000 to 25,000 bracket and across a wide swath of industries. We also partnered with an external research firm to go out and poll a bunch of CIOs that were not in the Sapphire Ventures network so that we could get a broader and more agnostic sample of CIOs across the board. And we found some compelling indicators of exactly how intertwined CIOs, IT, and startups are. As I mentioned before, for us, really where the rubber meets the road is the innovation landscape, the actual adoption level. So let's see what we found. When we asked CIOs to estimate what percentage of their IT budgets were currently being consumed by technology from VC-backed startups, we got a median figure of 10%. We think that's remarkable. This is the first time that we've actually ever seen sort of an estimated view of how startups are faring within the overall share of wallet, if you will, in the budget. What's also remarkable is that on a median basis, CIOs estimated that in a year, that is going to be 15%. They anticipate and expect that in a year, startups will take up 15% of IT budgets in their organizations. That's 50% growth. We know IT budgets are not growing 50%. And I'd love to pause here and actually get a sense from the room. Who here among the CIOs and the IT executives, raise your hand if you believe this is generally within the ballpark of how your organization fares when it comes to adoption of startups. How many think it's too low? How many think it's okay? And how many think it's a little high? All right, so even spread across the board. Directionally, VC funding for enterprise startups is, of course, robust as ever. $42 billion went in last year into B2B startups, and obviously a lot of these dollars are starting to find their way into IT budgets. Yes, good question. We did define that in the survey. Obviously, you have everything from seed stage startups to pre-IPO startups. We have many of those across both ends of the spectrum here at the event today. The way we defined it in the survey was a private, venture-backed technology company that had raised venture capital funding and was experiencing high growth. So that was the technical definition. We do know that there are $35 billion startups out there today, and there are going to be exceptions like that, but that was the guidance that we provided. So we've established a basic adoption statistic for startups in IT. What are some of the ups and downs of this? When we offered CIOs a series of multiple choice options to describe the value they received relative to established vendors in working with startups, beyond better customer experience, some of the sort of top-cited areas of advantage were things like having more modern architecture, greater ability to influence the startup's roadmap, and faster pace of product delivery. And we believe all of these reported benefits ultimately are a reflection of the CIO's desire and need for speed. Modern architecture, which is typified by paradigms like DevOps, microservices, the API economy, ultimately has the net impact of accelerating digital outcomes. And more flexible product roadmaps, more agile roadmaps, as startups apparently offer to enterprise CIOs, just allow for more compressed iteration timeframes. Faster fails for startups lead to faster successes as well for CIOs and customers. In all of our work with CIOs, Sapphire is increasingly seeing that for them, often strategy is speed is a strategy unto itself. In fact, when we asked CIOs in a different part of the study what motivates them to explore emerging technologies, the number one answer we got was accelerating time to market. But it's not all rosy. It never is. Two commonly cited challenges of working with startups included concerns around global scalability, geographical footprint, and some concerns around technology scalability. The geographical piece in particular is somewhat expected based on the very large enterprise and very global profile of a lot of the companies that were in the study. And as such, it would also appear to be consistent with another finding that we had elsewhere in the study, where CIOs expressed a stark preference for working with later stage startups versus early stage startups. I think about 60 to 70% of CIOs said they prefer to work with mid to late stage startups. And typically, those are the ones post-Series C, D, E of funding that start to have stable international operations, multilingual product support, et cetera. Next, we looked at which emerging technology CIOs are actively investing in. We asked them about 12 domains that we framed for them with basically yes or no questions on whether they were actively investing in those areas. And no shocker, AI, ML at the very top, with 81% of CIOs saying they're actively investing there. What's also remarkable is that for all but one of these categories, a majority of CIOs said that they're actively investing in almost every area that we polled them on. The number that came as a curious surprise to the Sapphire Ventures team was actually a number that an area that was a huge topic of conversation in Jason's presentation, which is that 38% of the CIOs came back and said they're investing in some sort of project around quantum computing. We were not actually expecting that number to be that high. So again, curious for show of hands, raise your hand if you're a CIO whose organization is investing in some way around quantum. All right, well, this was obviously a leading sample that we had there. Of the VCs in the room, raise your hand if you're investing in quantum. All right, we have 1, 2, OK. Find the CIOs and bring them up to speed with the crew here. Interestingly, in the weeks following concluding the study and seeing this finding, we started to see reports that a lot of the major management consulting companies are actually doubling down on building up larger organizations to do quantum computing projects with their corporate clients. So some interesting indicators there. Now the view gets more interesting. With CIOs indicating where they are working with startups and or with established vendors in each of these areas. So for all of the CIOs that said yes to investing in one of those emerging technology domains, we asked them to annotate where you're working with a startup and or where you're working with an established vendor. With AI, it appears that CIOs were almost twice as likely to say that they were investing with startups than they were with an established player, with 36% of CIOs saying they're working with an established player and 67% indicating startups. It's a similar story with augmented analytics as well, although not quite to the same degree as it is with AI ML. And a lot of the shining stars in the Sapphire Ventures portfolio, many of whom are here today, companies like ThoughtSpot, DataRobot, Alation, Matillion, and many others are frankly riding these waves of adoption, helping drive a lot of these waves of adoption as well. And everywhere else, startups certainly are a key feature in pretty much all of the emerging technology categories that we put in front of CIOs. But the other side of the coin is really interesting as well. For a number of categories, such as cybersecurity, such as containers, microservices, digital marketing, and sales, these are hot areas of VC investment with a high level of existing VC investment and quickly rising as well, where CIOs were actually more likely to say, much more likely in some cases, that they were investing with a large established major vendor than they were to say that they were investing with a startup. And I think there's many ways to digest and interpret this data, but I think the one thing that indicates is just how vibrant the innovation ecosystem and the innovation landscape within the CIO's world is. And as this melting pot of startups and larger vendors starts to come together in the enterprise, we have a situation where we have over 75% of CIOs that said they expected the number of IT vendors in their IT portfolio to either stay flat or to increase, with very few saying that they actually expected fewer vendors a year from now. And again, would love a show of hands. Which CIOs in the room believe that they're going to have more vendors a year from now? OK. And how many think they're going to have fewer vendors? Anybody? All right. Wendy, you're really leading in that category. So anybody who's working with Wendy, be really careful. Stay on Wendy's good side, because that number is going in a different direction. Wendy does run a very tight ship. Well, it's interesting. There was a time when CIOs would talk ambitiously about vendor consolidation projects. But as one global CIO recently pointed out to me in a conversation that we were having, he said, that ship has basically sailed. We know that innovation is coming from more and more, not from fewer vendors. What that places on CIOs, no surprise to all of you, is really the obligation to put in new tools and processes and strategies in place to really harness these dense and complex portfolios and to really manage these more federated kinds of landscapes that they have. And it is this sort of complexity in the IT and vendor portfolios that is putting huge strains on traditional old school IT operations management and actually giving way to whole new categories like AI ops. In fact, OpsRamp, one of the disruptors in the AI ops space that is in the Sapphire Ventures portfolio, and they're here today in the Innovation Lounge, is actually a company that is helping CIOs and IT address this very challenge. The other key area we looked at was in organizational process. So how do CIOs and their companies identify new emerging technologies, new startups? How do they figure out which ones to adopt? There's a lot of things we looked at, and a lot of those details are in the report. We just wanted to double click on some findings around POCs, because that seems to be a key feature with how CIOs assess startups, much more so than the occasional POC they might do with a larger vendor. 90% of CIOs said that they always or typically will do a POC with a startup before they actually roll out the technology productively. So clearly, POCs are the default gateway for adoption. And they're not quick. Over 60% of CIOs said that their average POC timeline is more than 3 months. And in a lot of individual conversations with CIOs, just anecdotally speaking, we always hear from CIOs that they hate long POCs that drag on. They don't like POCs that are sort of longer than a couple of months, and yet these numbers are what they are. And POCs don't always graduate, quote unquote. We asked CIOs to estimate what percentage of their POCs with startups result in productive implementations, and only 19% said that more than half of their POCs actually graduate. And so one of the questions is, and it really is a question at this point in time, is there such a thing as a good graduation rate? If your POC graduation rate is too high, does that mean you're not being selective enough in adopting very sort of focused, targeted emerging technologies? Or perhaps does it mean that your funnel of POCs is too small? If your POC graduation rate is too low, does that mean your POCs are going wrong somewhere? We're not actually claiming to know the definitive answer on this, but we do want to start a conversation, and we want to encourage CIOs and the innovation community to better document, understand, and track these metrics so we can all get to a more fine-tuned innovation process. And obviously, one question that we asked along the way was, what are some drivers of POC success? And one of the signals that came out in the data was kind of interesting, where CIOs, we asked them, do you have what you consider to be a comprehensive strategy for adoption of emerging technologies? And 47% said yes, and the remainder were, I have a limited strategy, or I have no strategy at all. And the CIOs who said that they had a comprehensive strategy for adoption of emerging technologies were much more likely to have shorter POCs in a lot of cases. And another interesting correlation that I think we'll have to unpack over time and hopefully keep building a bigger data set around is a correlation between the length of the POC and the chances of that POC graduating into a productive implementation. As one example, all the way on the right-hand side, you have where it says 50% or more. That's CIOs who said that more than 50% of their POCs graduate into actual implementations. The CIOs that said their average POC length was less than 3 months were 3x as likely, 34%, to be in that top performing bracket than CIOs who said that their POCs ran for 6, 12 months or longer. In our work with a lot of progressive CIOs, we have seen a lot of specific approaches and behaviors that we think sets a lot of CIOs up for success. It's as much art, it's not really a science. And it goes down to setting a very clear timeline of when you're going to adopt which emerging technologies in the enterprise, ruthlessly prioritizing use cases and business outcomes, and taking a lot of time to really align within IT and outside of IT on what that strategy is. And lastly, we looked at the individual engagement that CIOs have, and we were pretty struck by some of these numbers. 50% of CIOs in the study said that they are an advisor to a startup. Now, that term can be interpreted quite broadly, from being on a formal advisory board to just advising a startup, but would love a show of hands here amongst the CIOs. How many of you are advisor to a startup today? Some pretty solid numbers there. And clearly, there's a range of different benefits that CIOs expect. Board member was another interesting one. And actually, from a forward-looking perspective, when we asked them, would you like to be involved? If you're not involved, would you like to be involved in different ways with startups? And 2/3 interested in serving as a board member. And one of our panel sessions this afternoon, CIOs and boards, is that a match made in heaven? We'll talk about what board service is all about. So what does this mean for all the CIOs in the room? Well, for one, we think there's some interesting signals in the data about CIOs that actually have developed comprehensive strategies for adopting emerging technology and some better outcomes they may have. So if you don't already have a strategy, then invest the time to develop one and align on it with your organization. Secondly, this one may seem obvious, but we think you should benchmark your company's individual innovation index metrics relative to what we see here. And if you are outperforming a lot of these metrics, then whether in the form of shorter POCs or really good POC graduation rates, kudos to you. Go tell your bosses. And if your organization is consistently deviating in the other direction, perhaps like significantly lower POC graduation rates or average POCs that go on for 10 months or more, or maybe anemic spending on startup tech relative to your IT budget, then maybe ask some questions. And lastly, we did see some interesting data in the study where over 70% of CIOs said that today they are appointing a dedicated leader for startup engagement. For the startup CEOs in the room, a few ways to digest and act on this data. If you have a sales pipeline that is chock full of POCs, maybe use some of this data to score your pipeline accordingly. Train your salespeople to understand whether the customer they're talking to actually has a comprehensive strategy for the specific emerging technology area you represent. They might be more likely to convert into actual adopters. Address CIO concerns early on and establish expectations and build marketing presence in relevant influencer channels, and there's more detail on that in the report that we'll share. And last but not the least, a nod to the giants, the major established players, and there's a few of those here with us today. You're very much in the innovation mix. In fact, in a number of the emerging technology categories that we looked at, you are the central part of the innovation mix. So that's a huge foundational strength that you have. But do understand the shifting IT portfolios you operate in, and keep an eye out for winning startups that you could ally with or otherwise learn from. Going forward, we want to turn this into an annual index where we track the trend line of some of these metrics over time. And the second thing we want to do, and we would absolutely love your feedback here as we evolve this, is we want to correlate it to measures of business performance. So over time, we want to collect more data on things like company profitability, revenue growth, IT department sort of efficiency, KPIs, so that we can start building correlations also between level of startup engagement, adoption level of emerging tech, and actual business outcomes. And lastly, we want to bring our beloved startup community into this framework as well and start getting them to report some of their metrics in terms of the processes they go through with CIOs. So there you have it, just a few highlights from our maiden effort to benchmark the state of startup engagement within IT. We would love your participation in building this index. If you haven't participated, and by the way, huge note of thanks to a number of the CIOs and companies that participated, Chevron, Bank of America, Mohawk Industries that are in the room today. If you haven't participated in the index study, we'll be sharing with you a unique link tomorrow to become a part of the study. We'll also be sharing a link to the full report. We want to start a conversation. This is not an ending, it's a beginning, and we hope that you will be part of the journey and help us build a better index over time.